everybody, and welcome to our 2011 Summer Poinsettia series. This is Rebecca Siemonsma from the Ecke Ranch, Tech Services Manager, and I also have Roger Kehoe with me today. He's in Tech Services and our Key Account Sales Manager for the Southeast and up to the Mid-Atlantic. Go ahead and say hi there for a sec, Roger.
Well, welcome everybody to our first webinar of the poinsettia season. Hard to believe we're there already, but we're ready to go, and we'll be hitting our peak shipping season of Unrooted in just a few weeks, so it's definitely poinsettia time.
Okay, yep, this actual poinsettia webinar today is perfectly timed because some of you may have received your first shipments this week, some of you have them coming next week, and so it's a good time just to reflect on poinsettia propagation, and we're really excited about the series this year. We've got 5 future webinars that we'll talk with you about at the end of the session. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a reminder, those of you that have done our webinars before know that you can ask questions using the question and answer toolbar. We'll address as many as time allows with periodic stops throughout, and any unanswered questions can be addressed via email after the session. You can find the recorded version of today's session at On Media, which is housed at www.ecke.com. So if you or your staff would like to go back and view the session again, it will be available about 24 hours after the recorded session today. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of what we'll be discussing today, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Today's outline will include greenhouse preparation, receiving and processing cuttings, sticking cuttings, direct sticking, which is a topic that we really haven't talked about in detail in previous webinars, moisture management, fertility, height management, environmental management, disease and insect management, and then we'll round it out with common issues seen in propagation. And quality, good poinsettia crop always starts with quality cuttings, and this is a nice picture of what you can expect to receive from the Ecke Ranch, a nicely toned cutting with good leaf expansion, nice stem caliper. We do have our stock grown offshore in Guatemala, as many of you know. We've had 2 large farms in the past. This year we did expand, and we have a 3rd farm, which is so new that we don't have an aerial shot of yet. You know, important about this 3rd farm is that we didn't increase the number of stock plants that we're actually growing. We just gave the stock plants that we are growing more room so that we can produce better toned cuttings, you know, with things like better fertility management, less growth regulators, etc. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Roger, and he's going to talk with us about greenhouse preparation. Roger, did I lose you?
Nope, still in here.
Okay.
Preparation is where it all begins. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right. First thing is to clean the greenhouse out well. I know many of you use leaf blowers, power wash the greenhouse, and you know how to disinfect, but really pay special attention to the pipes and drains. Drains especially can become fungus gnat hotels. It's really good to get the algae and any other accumulation, dirt and debris, because algae seems to grow better and then fungus gnats follow algae. If you have any dirt residue around, seems to make it harder for the disinfectants to work, and at the same time makes for a great breeding ground as the algae builds and builds and builds. So something to think about. Once it gets wet, you start propagation. It's really hard to do a cleanup after the plants are already in place. At Ecke, we lime the floors. I know many of you are liming floors. The lime is a great way to disinfect the floor, clean it, keep the weeds out, and does have a good impact on reducing thrips, and especially with dirt floors, it keeps the concrete floors cleaner longer into the propagation process, keeps the algae down and so forth. So it's a great opportunity there to take it to a cleaner level than just a washed floor. And you can see in the next slide, we've got rates, 3 50-pound bags of it's a whitewash type of lime, a powdered lime mixed with 50 gallons of water. Keep it in agitation, use a slurry pump, paint it across the floor. Slurry covers about 1,000 square feet, and you can add copper sulfate to the slurry for additional algae control at a pound in a gallon. So a good way to get started and cleaned up before the plants arrive. Good to let that dry before you start to use water for mist, so try to do it ahead of time. Planting labor, take a look at those numbers. Maybe take a look at your orders, schedule your labor. You don't want cuttings sitting around waiting for you to have the right number of people to get the planting done. The cuttings need to be handled quickly, so especially with very large orders, it's really important to have that scheduled. You can track your order and know exactly when it's going to arrive by using our on time. Click on that icon and with your order number you can pull up the latest information and know exactly where your order is and confirm and even pull a packing list off of that. So use that. If you need any help with it, you can contact me or Rebecca, or contact your key accounts manager or the Encinitas office and get that information. They'll help walk you through that process. Great tool to use. Prepare the media. Make sure you have it. It's clean. Pre-wet it. Not too far in advance. Certainly no more than 1 day. If you water it too many days in advance, you could end up with more Erwinia problems. We'll talk about that later. You can dibble, have everything prepared, but just don't do it too far in advance. Be ready for it. Don't plant in dry media. And how to process cuttings upon arrival. We suggest open the box and record the temperature. You want to know how they're doing. And you have to do that right away. Remove bags and place on racks in the cooler. You can also open the boxes and leave the cuttings in the box, but it helps to get gas exchange and get a lower temperature if the box happens to overheat in the shipping process. So leave the cuttings in the plastic bags so that you don't desiccate. You need the humidity. If you can keep your humidity high in the air in the cooler, that's even better. 55 degrees is a good temperature. And don't remove too many from the cooler to the greenhouse, certainly not more than you can plant in about an hour. And better to keep them in the cooler longer just before planting. Some growers like to store cuttings actually prior to sticking them, especially if they find them warm, and try to get the turgidity up in the cutting before planting, and that's a good goal. Sometimes in the real world you may not have time to do that completely, but certainly it's not too useful if you try to rehydrate at 8 o'clock in the morning and then try to plant at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when it's hot. So you've got to take all that into account and when your labor is available, and do your planting as best you can. But certainly storing them in the cooler is a better place than having them lay on the greenhouse bench for a long time waiting to get planted. There's a good illustration of too many cuttings laid out for the number of people you see standing there at the greenhouse, and that's just a disaster waiting to happen. And I hope that's not 11 a.m. just before lunch. It's going to be a while before those cuttings get planted. So just something to think about as you schedule the work. And the other thing is, if the crews leave the area, make sure someone puts that mist back on. Make sure that while they're taking a break or whatever, you've got the plants wet, because that whole first 24 hours is so critical not to let the cuttings dry down. And watch for your rate of leaf curl. If you're getting behind, if the leaves really start to curl badly, they should pretty much lay out flat, limp, and then within 2 or 3 days be standing up pretty good for you. This is how they arrive. Shot of our boxes, plastic inside. Again, it's good the boxes are opened up, so it's like it's on a cart in the cooler, and you're getting gas exchange. If the boxes were overheated, the cool air now from the cooler is getting down into the box better, but they won't desiccate because they're still in the plastic. So a good idea, open some up, check the cuttings, see what the condition is. The ice that we put in goes in the middle panel there, and then the cuttings are stacked along the sides. So really good to do an inspection, and for very least, just get the boxes open. Even if you can't take the bags out, put them into trays or whatever. At least get the box open. And a shot of the label there, typical label information. Again, box 6 of 36 it says. You can pull your packing list, know exactly where the cuttings are. It may help you organize your cuttings. There's a certain order that you want to plant in. Typically more sensitive varieties should be planted first. You can find those quick and easy just using the the numbers on the box, and the packing list. And there's samples of the labels that come with the cuttings. We highly recommend those labels stay with the cuttings. If you notice, there's information there, location, that's the range F13, house 1, bench 1. We're able to trace back. We can track our cutting, and if there are any problems, certainly we all know how valuable being able to trace back is. So the large number on a piece of paper there is the cutter number, and it's just good if you stick that with all the moisture that's around, it'll stick right to that plastic label. But leave those in around the cuttings as well. And if we see something, we may ask you for that information and get that feedback to our production team in Guatemala so that we can correct whatever the situation is. Any questions?
Roger, we do have a question that's come in. This person is wondering what type of lime we're using for the lime slurry and how often it's reapplied.
It's called hydrated lime, and it's I think they used to use it as whitewash on fences. It's a finely ground lime, not like a granular lime that you would put in your soil or on your lawn. And it becomes in solution a slurry with water, and you paint it on, you let it dry. And that's the key. Typically, you can get it on before you do your planting, but once you go into propagation mode, it's generally too wet to try to come in and put more down. It will never dry, and you end up just collecting it on your shoes and becomes kind of a mess. So it's a pre-preparation, pre-plant process to get that lime and put it down. That's a good question.
And when we do it at the ranch, we do it twice a year. So it generally, is very effective for about a 6-month period if we've got crops in there the whole time. So the next question is wondering what our thoughts are about actually removing the cuttings from the bags. We talked about possibly removing them from the boxes, but how about taking them out of the bags?
We do have growers that do that, but to do it properly, you've got to have humidity or mist or fog in your cooler, and you've got to wet the cuttings down. And even if you wet the cuttings down, you've got fog, you still should be covering them with wet paper. You can't let them desiccate, and they will desiccate easily. And you may think, well, it's cool and kind of humid and feels damp in the cooler, but your relative humidity may not be anywhere near saturation, and that's enough to desiccate the cutting. You should be near 100% humidity around those cuttings, as close to it as you can get as you store them in the cooler. So if you're going to take them out, not a bad idea, but you have to be very careful that you keep them wet or have them misted or assign somebody to make sure that that happens in the cooler.
Okay, very good. So we've covered all the questions that have come in about these two topics. With that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the actual process of sticking the cuttings. Question that I often get, probably one of the most common questions that I get this time of year is from growers regarding the use of rooting hormone. We do recommend the use of rooting hormone. There are some cultivars that definitely root very easily without rooting hormone. However, we find that it does enhance uniformity and it decreases the time to rooting. So, you'll see more uniform roots and, possibly shave off your time in propagation by, 3, 4, 5 days. A good product for growers to use would be Dip and Grow. That's the product of choice. And for the Dip and Grow, you start with 20 parts the Dip and Grow, and then 1 part Dip and Grow and mix with 20 parts water. And this yields a finished solution of 500 parts per million IBA and 250 parts per million NAA. So, I know there are some growers out there possibly mixing their own rooting hormone. That is something that we did at the ranch for a number of years, which we don't do anymore, but that's what you'd want to yield in your final solution would be the 500 part per million IBA, 250 NAA. We want to rapid dip the base of the cutting just for a brief second. We're only dipping the very base of the cutting. If you expose the leaves or the petioles to the rooting hormone, it will result in some twisting and distortion of the petals or petioles and leaves. And if that happens, that is something that's not detrimental. The cuttings generally grow out of it, but it does slow the process of rooting up a little bit. We do have some growers now that are experimenting with using a potassium IBA spray applied overhead after sticking. This is something that a lot of pelargonium growers do. It's applied at 100 parts per million, and the benefits of the IBA spray is that it can be applied up to 7 days after sticking. So if it's a situation where rooting hormone wasn't applied, it's not like it has to be done right away. It could be done up to 7 days, and there still have been some realized benefits from applying up to 7 days afterwards. It can also be tank mixed with fungicide. So, a real good instance where I could see that this would be beneficial is if the cuttings, maybe got heated up in transit or weren't processed quickly, and as a result you see some leaf yellowing and some leaf loss. That leaf loss can translate to some slower days in rooting. And so, number one, because of the leaf loss and leaf yellowing, you're going to have to put on a fungicide, and then applying the KIVA would help in, kind of get back some of that time that you've lost from the leaf, from the yellowing leaves in terms of rooting. This is something that we definitely recommend trialing first. Trialing is always a good idea. If you've not used this technique before, it should be trialed. As Roger mentioned, sticking sensitive varieties first is always a good idea. The thought, kind of the rule of thumb has always been that light leaf cultivars should be stuck first because they are more sensitive to botrytis and things like environmental stresses. However, there are some dark leaf cultivars that express an equal amount of stress and should probably be first on the sticking list. So, I always tell growers, do what you know. If you've propagated these varieties before and it's been your experience that a certain variety is, more sensitive than others, then stick that variety first. We want to pay close attention to planting depth. When you look at the cutting to the left there, when it's stuck down towards the end of the wedge or to the bottom of the wedge, the flow of oxygen or the amount of oxygen at the bottom of the wedge is definitely reduced. You're definitely going to see an impact on rooting when it's stuck that deep. And if that petiole is stuck below the base of the media line, you're going to lose that leaf. It's going to end up falling off and yellowing, which can increase your chances of disease and especially botrytis. So pay close attention to planting depth. Uncovering tips is an important part of the sticking process. If you've got tips that are covered by overlapping leaves from adjacent cuttings, you can see definite slower rooting on that cutting of the tip that's covered. But then also when it comes to growth regulator applications or pesticide applications, it's real difficult to get spray coverage when you've got tips covered. So, you want to train your labor so that when they're sticking, they're lining up the cuttings nicely so that they're all the tips are exposed. And this is a real good picture of a strip where, the cuttings were just stuck and they weren't positioned so that the tips are uncovered. And then a picture here of what it looks like, when the tips are uncovered. And this is something that, probably 2 or 3 times throughout the course of propagation, you might have to have labor go back through and expose tips as those cuttings begin to put on new vegetative growth. You can have some tips that get covered back up. So this is a real good picture of the base of the cutting in week 1 and what it should look like upon arrival. Then we have week 2. We've got some nice callus completely encompassing the tissue. Root initials are present. At this point you want to watch misting frequency closely still until the cutting is completely encompassed in callus. That cutting can't take up any moisture from the media, so it's really important to still have a nice constant film of moisture on the leaf surface. And we'll talk about that further when we get into misting guidelines. And some of your more vigorous varieties, once they start to put on that callus formation, it might be time to put on a PGR. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail. In week 3, we've got roots starting to go out and circle that wedge. At this point, the cuttings are still not ready for the stresses of the greenhouse. They're probably not going to, stay nice and turgid in a hot summer greenhouse. Light intensity and air movement should be increased to tone the cutting. So, we're allowing a little bit more light in, maybe cracking the vents a little bit to get some air exchange. And depending on the environment, misting may stop at night at this point. It just depends on how well the cuttings are rooted. And for the more vigorous varieties, a second PGR application may be needed. And this is week 4. This is a nicely rooted cutting that's ready for transplant. It's been through a toning environment, and it's got nice root expansion, and it should do well in establishing. Another good picture of a different media option here. This looks like it's in an Ellie pot. And then we have, again, a nicely rooted oasis wedge. Do I have any questions that have come through about sticking in oasis or other strips? While I look through questions, Roger, any additional comments?
No, just it's very important to track the progress of the cuttings. Keep pulling them out many times a week, looking to see how the progress of the callus and the rooting process is. You need to know if it stalls. So, and then take a look at why things are going a little bit slow. But reading the plants, seeing how they're doing, where they are in that timeline that Rebecca just offered is very important.
So this is a great question that's come in. Do we have a particular preference in terms of media when we're rooting in strips? And what would be the advantages and the disadvantages to the different types?
Well, there are many that are used, and many of them are used successfully. I think the important thing with the media is to make sure that you've got adequate air within the media based on your application methods of water, fertilizer, irrigation, and mist, and the shade levels and all. They all have to be tied together. The problem generally that we see with poor quality media, given if the pH is correct and those other simple tests that can be done are give you good results, would be that you just don't have the right amount of porosity in the media. You've got not enough air, and that causes callus issues and some problems and slows the cuttings down, and you get uneven rooting and other attributes. So you want to make sure, if you're using a peat-based media, that you don't have too many fines in there that combined with the water just keeps the oxygen out, and you end up with a very poor quality cutting. And that poinsettias are very sensitive to. They need oxygen in the media, and I'll talk about that in the direct stick section as well.
Okay. Are you aware of any growers that are actually, I know that we'll talk about dibbling when it comes to direct sticking, but are you aware of any growers that are dibbling when they're sticking in Ellie's or Oasis?
Oasis is pre-punched? I don't think so. They've got a hole in it, and Ellipots, it depends on how difficult it is to stick. If it's pretty well packed, then they ought to question if it's too tightly packed, because again that blocks out oxygen. Then some are dibbling and some are not. One of the advantages to the dibbled hole too is you don't have to hold the stem as hard when you actually stick the cutting if there is a pre-punched hole. The tendency is, if the media is a little bit hard, you hold the stem harder so it doesn't slip out of your fingers, and you push down hard, and now you're possibly damaging the end of the cutting and the stem by squeezing too hard. And we'll talk about that a bit in the future, but that will give you an opportunity for Erwinia and other disease organisms to get into the stem and cause severe losses to occur. So it's all tied together and very important.
Plus, with dibbling, you get consistent sticking depth. That's another, if you've got a dibbler tool made, you get a nice consistent sticking depth, and you don't have issues with too deep or too shallow. So it looks like the rest of the questions that have come in are topics that we'll be covering in a few minutes. So we should go ahead and move on, and Roger's going to talk with us about direct sticking now.
Yeah, a lot of poinsettias are direct stuck into the funnel container, and it's a great way to propagate them, but you do have to be careful. You don't want to plant in just plain dry soil that's like powder. Certainly it should have moisture in it. It will get more moisture, of course, in the misting process, but to plant in completely dry media doesn't hold the cutting up properly. It could desiccate before you get around to watering or get the moisture level high enough in the media, so some caution should be used there. Here's the dibble brought up. The hole itself does help with planting depth, as Rebecca mentioned, and it also helps get oxygen to the base of the cutting if the hole's a little bit larger than the cutting diameter. So just something to think about. You stick the cutting, but don't water it in. You don't want to close up that hole that you have so that you've got more oxygen. That's perfect for callus. And if any of you have ever dropped a cutting in the propagation table where it's just sitting out in the air with good mist, it'll callus. It just won't root. So callus really does do well in very high oxygen environment. And that's one of the reasons, if you don't get any callus, look for the amount of porosity and make sure you have enough oxygen at the base of the cutting. And then after the callus is formed and you're ready for the rooting stage, you can just water it in with a nutrient solution to close the hole and get that nutrient charge into the media that you need. Dibbling, there's very simple dibblers. They do regulate the depth of the hole if the soil is in the pot at the right depth, and you don't damage the cutting. You just sort of gently lay it in there, and it will callus very nicely, and then close the hole up a week or so later when you add nutrient solution. Wow, yeah, maybe some of you are laughing right now, but that's a little deep. You can lose a tip, of course, and just not a good planting job. So certainly something to watch. Be careful with your cutting length and training and so forth. Make sure that the cuttings are properly planted. There's a nice table, good mist going on. Cuttings are standing up nicely. And looks like a really good environment. You see a lot of poly around. You know, there's a lot of humidity in there. You can just see it laying in, and that's how you really want to propagate a poinsettia, especially after about day 2 or 3. It should be uncomfortable walking through there. It should be very damp and warm, extremely warm, and you should not be comfortable working in that environment. Be careful if a crew goes in to clean up or do some work that they don't just leave fans on and dry those things down too quickly, because poinsettias are extremely sensitive to humidity, low levels at this stage. Timeline here, going through some days. Prepare for the cuttings, pre-wet the media, grade the cuttings for uniformity. It's always good to get another grade on them when you can. Temperature 64 a night is fine for the first few days. May help keep the Erwinia pressures down. Cutting isn't really growing, so it doesn't need 68, 72 degrees at that point. You may have it anyway because it's hot and it's summer. It depends on when you're propagating and where you are. Mist twice during the night. Don't let them dry out. That's the key. You've got to get the turgor back in them. That's the first thing. Then we'll worry about temperature and putting roots on them later, but get them standing up. Gradually increase temperatures if the cuttings are turgid, so once you get to that stage, day 2, day 3, uncover tips, walk the crop, take a look, you know, make sure they're all standing up. Make sure all your mist nozzles aren't clogged too. Good time to take a look there. Day 3, maintain aggressive temperatures. Nights can be warmer. You can start to build more warmth. Keep the soil good and warm, especially in those large containers. You don't want them to cool down, and especially in the north. You may see that in August where the nights are cooling off. You may need some heat, but uncover tips, repair pots if you need to. If you have any losses or something, it's a good time you can recombine a few and keep your pots full on multi-plants. You can use Safari Drench, 12 24 ounces and 100 gallons for fungus gnat control. Again, the liming, general cleanliness, and sanitation will help manage fungus gnats as well. Follow recommendations on the label regarding the volume of finished solution to apply to the pots. Be very sensitive to that. Continue aggressive temperatures and uncover tips day 6. And leaf pick, do a little sanitation cleanup if needed. And you can begin to reduce your night mist just one time during the night to maintain humidity. Day 7, apply B9 and Cycocel. Really important. If you're going to need growth regulators, and you've got to read the cuttings and take a good look at them, that day 7, you know, day 7, 8 application really helps prevent stretch in this very aggressive humid environment that you've got. Keeps the nodes stacked nicely, and if you're going to pinch, that's really nice to have, and helps create a more level table of plants so that the early rooters don't jump ahead of the others. So there's some rates there: 1200 to 2500 B9 and Cycocel, generally tank mix 750 1500 parts per million. Day 8, you can fertilize overhead to close the dibble holes and start reducing mist frequency. Do that very gradually and watch your weather conditions. Maintain aggressive temperatures and humidity. By aggressive, we mean good warm temperatures that you're likely uncomfortable walking in, and really high humidity that you're really uncomfortable walking in. Poinsettias do very well in a very sweaty environment. Apply humidity to the floor. If the floors start to dry or the area, you know, or you got concrete, keep that area wet. It helps hold the humidity in the greenhouse, especially if you have areas that don't have plants and they're just wide open. It's good to wet those down too if they're nearby. And day 10, uncover tips, leaf pick, and discontinue that night mist. You should be able to by day 10. And then day 11, you're maintaining aggressive temperatures and humidity. By day 12, you certainly by then should see good callus formation. Now you're going to start to absorb all those nutrients you've been putting on really well, start to get some roots starting to initiate, and reduce mist frequency further. You can hand mist some areas. You still need the mist. You still need good humidity, especially during the middle of the day when it's hot. And watch that carefully. Your light level shouldn't be too high. Day 14, you can come in and do another application of Cycocel and B9. And day 15, fertilize again, and humidity kept high. Day 16, floors wet, and so forth. So it's an extended period. It's a good couple weeks. You've got to really run what we call an aggressive environment. Day 17, uncover tips and leaf pick, and 18, reduce mist further, hand mist slow areas. Don't let them dry out. You know, you may see some unevenness. You've got to address the plants that are the furthest behind. So don't don't fail to watch those. They might be around the edges. They might be near the fan where the intake is, or near a door. Be really careful. Try to protect those. Put some plastic up if you can. Block the air movement, and keep the plant so that the stress is minimized. The roots are continuing to develop. Once you get a good root system, they're a lot tougher and they're able to handle drier, breezier environment. Minimize mist 1 or 2 times per day, by day 19. Especially if it's hot, maybe you guys still got to mist them 4 or 5 times, between 10 o'clock and 3 p.m. But keep the humidity high. Read the plants. If you start to see the leaves curling up, that means they're too dry. Gradual change because the tissue's soft. You just come out of propagation, and they don't respond well to a sudden environmental change. Maintain temperatures in the mid-80s. Again, that's very warm, but poinsettias do well at this stage in a warm temperature. Final spacing for fast rooters, day 21. Watch the environment closely. So you can start to separate some, move them out if you can, or if you have the labor. You may want to start spacing, but if you start to move them at all, you're going to have to go back to some misting and help the plants adjust to a more open, less crowded environment with lower humidity. And you can remove some shade 10 to 14 days after spacing, but again, be conservative on that. Keep the light levels down. Days are long. There's plenty of light there for good growth. You just need to build the plant first. If you dry it and harden it too much at the end of propagation, and it's not going to tone it better for the final growing greenhouse. You need to keep it really humid on them for really the first 6 weeks or so, and adjust your environment based on growth and the weather. Any questions, Rebecca?
We do have a question about the type of media, either recommended for direct stick, or I guess if you're propagating in a different strip other than Oasis, what would be the percentage of perlite that we would recommend to be used in a peat-based media?
Well, maybe a third. There's a lot of things that factor into that, and there may be other things in the media. You can use bark in the media as well, but you got to be careful. Anything that's hard like bark, you got to stick the cutting in. You could damage the cutting, the base of the cutting. It's really important to dibble in a media like that. But it's all about the porosity and what it costs. But you have to really know your peat moss and make sure you've got the right kind to do that successfully. And if you're used to using a peat-lite mix with, perlite, vermiculite, peat moss, bark, and then you change to just a pure peat mix, you got to really relearn irrigation and how to handle the cuttings through that. But generally, in most of the commercial media, you can be successful with a poinsettia today, as long as your basic porosity is close and you've got a good pH and you maintain your nutrient status where it needs to be.
We have a question that's come in about fungicide applications and if it's necessary. We mentioned a fungicide drench after spacing and direct sticking. Didn't really talk about a fungicide drench when sticking in traditional propagation. What would recommendations be for a fungicide drench, or if they're using Xeritol in the mist, is that enough?
Xeritol may or may not be enough. It's not as active as using like a Chipco Cleary's combination, for example. But first things first, make sure you've got sanitation in the propagation area. So pick those dead leaves out of there. Get anything that's going to grow botrytis. Usually it's botrytis at this stage that will attack the plants. Make sure your handlers are not roughing up the cuttings so that you're getting damage that creates further problems. There'll be enough damage just from the shipping process, but you shouldn't aggravate that with more damage while planting. But generally, you can come in. It's hard to get in before day 4 or 5 with any kind of fungicide spray if you feel you need to do it. It needs to be done like late in the day so that it gets some chance to somewhat dry during the night. Mist will wash it off pretty effectively if you try to put it on first thing in the morning or the middle of the day for sure. And some of the chemicals are hot, so you've got to be very careful about the selection, following the labels, and definitely use lower rates where you can and trial areas before you just go in and do a whole big spray in a huge area.
And I guess that I would add to that too, it just depends on, what your typical disease pressure is like and if environmental conditions are warranting an application, if you've got a certain pressure of Erwinia present, or, there was a situation where you've got some leaf yellowing setting in and botrytis is setting, and I think if conditions warrant, you definitely shouldn't just rely on xerotol in the mist for suppression. That's a good preventative measure, but, if there's a certain level of disease pressure present, then fungicide drenches are applications are definitely warranted. Question that we didn't really talk about in the beginning. Usually we talk about the different cutting sizes that we offer from ECHI. This particular person is wondering if it's typical or recommended to use a longer cutting for direct sticking.
Well, we do have a 3-inch cutting that's great for direct sticking, especially for those large containers, and it's fairly foolproof to plant it. You certainly find it harder to bury the tip like you saw in that one photo. 2-inch are used quite a bit for it, but I have to say even our Euro cutting, which is the smallest at 1.5 inches long, we do have a number of growers using that even in 3-plant 8s and 5-plant 10s. They have to give them a little more time maybe in the growing. It takes a little experience, but they just like that smaller cutting where they don't get leaf overlap and find it easier to use. So any of them can be used. They all work, but it's a matter of personal preference and other factors that each grower has to deal with. But the basics are there. The cuttings, no matter how large they are in our program, have the correct maturity of about a 6-week shoot to put out a good root system and perform well. So that might be something to trial if there are difficulties. If it's working and it isn't broken, don't try to fix it.
Okay, looks like we've covered all the questions there. We're going to move on to mist management now, which we've talked a little bit about, but we're going to get into some more detail about the specifics of misting and how important it is. Improper misting is probably the #1 reason for poor rooting or for unsuccessful propagation. When you have too much mist, you're misting too much, you're leaching too much of those nutrients out, so the cuttings often look very yellow. Too much misting cools the media and slows rooting, so even though you're maintaining a warm propagation environment, if you are misting frequently, you're definitely going to be cooling that media. Too much misting also leads to botrytis issues. It's just kind of thinning out that tissue and softening the cutting, and definitely creating a situation for botrytis to set in. And too much misting leads to slow rooting and uneven growth altogether. When you've got variable media levels of moisture in the media, and you're misting a lot, you've got some cuttings that are stretching, some cuttings that aren't, and you can also see that callus formation. It just gets kind of grossly large. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's a good indication that you're misting too much. Just some general misting guidelines. Roger's already mentioned this, but it's really important to have the misting ready to go as the cuttings are being stuck. You don't want to get those cuttings out there on the prop bench and not quite have the misting ready to go, or you'll see some significant leaf roll that's hard to get the cuttings to reverse from. Misting frequency is going to depend on light levels in the greenhouse, temperatures, humidity, and the amount of air movement that you've got. So those are kind of the 4 factors and environmental factors that you need to be monitoring and watching when you're deciding where your misting frequency needs to be. And keep in mind that that's going to change throughout the day. It's going to change at different times of the day, and it's going to change with changing weather patterns. So you need to be flexible with your mist. Ideal misting should maintain a constant film of moisture on the leaf surface without wetting the media. So remember, before that callus formation forms, that cutting can't take up any moisture out of the media. So you're not misting so that the media is saturated and there's a film of moisture on the leaf. That's not going to do any good, and that's over misting. We want to maintain close to 100% relative humidity. So like Roger said, it's uncomfortable. It's like being in the rainforest. And we want to supply, again, little or no water to the rooting medium. This is just a sample misting schedule. Again, this is going to vary pretty significantly depending on your environment. It's again, we want you to look at this and keep this just as a sample, but not, it's not the rule by any means. It's going to vary depending on your environment. The first day 1 through 3, we're looking at about every 10 minutes for 10 seconds, and then we can increase to every 15 minutes for 10 seconds. So we're keeping the duration the same, but increasing or decreasing the frequency in between, increasing the frequency in between. You can see that by day 22, we like to have the mist off, the plants off the mist if possible, but that just depends. Depends on temperatures, it depends on light levels, it depends on how quickly the plants have rooted. So this is just a hard and fast rule, and definitely not, definitely not set in stone. Night misting, day 1 through 7, it's probably going to be necessary 2 to 3 times a night for 10 seconds. I talk to growers that have to mist more than that. It just depends on how they manage their environment. I also talk to growers that have to mist less than that. By day 8 through 14, we should be down to stopping or at least one time at night. And this is a good picture of, how water and the amount of mist impacts rooting. You can see the cutting to the right has some real kind of coarse, thick roots, and there's that absence of those nice fine root hairs, and those nice fine root hairs are the ones that are going to be taking up nutrients for the cutting, and so overall plant quality is really going to be compromised if we're over misting. And again, I mentioned this before, but be flexible with the mist. The environment can change from hour to hour in the greenhouse. The weather patterns can change from hour to hour in the greenhouse. Hand misting may be necessary on the edges of the benches. So especially for you larger growers, you're going to want to have staff on hand that are, not only monitoring the automatic mist, but have someone on hand that can be checking those edges of the benches. And then there's also varietal differences in misting needs too. So keep that in mind. Signs that misting is excessive. Hopefully you've all, those of you that are propagating poinsettias have a soil moisture or a soil temperature probe and can be monitoring the temperature of that media. Check it several times throughout the day, especially in those first 3 to 5 days when you're misting a lot. If the media is cooling considerably compared to where your ambient air temperature is, you might be using too much mist. A grossly large callus formation with no root initials is also a sign that misting is excessive. That callus, it should just kind of encompass the stem, but it shouldn't be growing larger and larger and larger, and if that's the case, then misting is probably too heavy. If you're just not seeing root initials at all, or rooting is slow and inconsistent, it could be a sign that there's too much mist and uneven rooting. Botrytis is also a good sign. And then for those of you that are direct sticking or propagating in, something other than an oasis wedge or a sponge, if you've got fungus gnats, they like that wet environment, so it could be too much mist. And this is, where I talked about if you don't have the mist ready to go, when you get the cuttings in the prop environment, you get this nice little leaf roll here. And I had a grower this week refer to it as tacos. If it looks like a taco and it's curled up like that, then it means that it's inadequate. And when you get this kind of leaf roll, it's going to end up with leaf scarring, and it is hard to get those cuttings to restore their turgor pressure and to get them to come out of it, and rooting could be impacted. Always start with good water quality. This is something that is often overlooked and that we don't always think about. Water samples should be sent in prior to the season, and even if you're using like a municipal water source or well water, things can change, and so it's a good idea to have water samples sent out. Poor water quality is going to negatively impact the cutting, so we like to see where the nutrition levels are, where the alkalinity is, sodium level, all those things. If acidification is necessary due to your alkalinity levels and pH, do not use phosphoric acid in propagation, and water quality is also going to determine whether or not wetting agents or surfactants are used, which we'll talk about in a minute. And just use a clean water source. If you're using ponds and you're recirculating water, then you need to have really good sanitation in place, to clean that water. Ideally, it's best, if you're using a fresh water source to propagate poinsettias. Foliar wetting agents are often used in propagation. It's not really proven that they're needed. Definitely you can propagate without a capsule or suffusion or any of those different wetting agents. Beating up on the leaf surface is not necessarily an issue. If you've got your water beating up, that's not an issue, but if it's beating up to the point that it's running off into the media and it's not keeping that cutting or that leaf surface adequately cooled, that's when it's an issue. So, that's where we talk about it regaining turgor pressure faster. It may be useful with large mist, if your mist heads have a larger droplet size, it does help break down the drops, but we want to use sparingly and never allow it to dry out on the leaves. I generally say, look at the recommended rates and back off on what's recommended on the label because it's generally too high. This is a good picture here of what it looks like without capsule. This particular scenario here, a wetting agent was not used, but there's water beads on the leaves, but the cuttings are turgid. And so, this is a situation where this particular grower is getting away without the use of surfactant. And some factors that, we would want to consider is not using it in excess, what's the cost, and then interaction with other chemical sprays too, because you do have to be careful with your growth regulators when you use a surfactant. Good picture here of it beating up again, but as you can see, those cuttings are turgid, so it's okay to get by without it. Another picture here. And any comments, Roger, while I'm looking through the questions?
Yeah, we talk about water quality. It comes up quite a bit, and growers say, well, I do okay. I propagate geraniums, and that works fine. Well, that is good in February and March, but in the summertime, you may be using 5 to 10 times as much water keeping your poinsettias going through propagation in July than any February or March propagation, almost anywhere in the U.S. So you're applying a lot more water, and that's when, if there's a problem with the water, there's impurities, there's phosphorus, excessive calcium or other elements or boron, that just the constant depositing and the extra amount of moisture that you're applying makes the opportunity greater for difficulties based on water quality. So we do recommend testing has to be clean. If you are growing mums, you're growing some other crop, maybe you don't need on a non-prop environment to worry so much about your water quality, but you should use the very best water you have available in your poinsettia propagation.
Okay, this is a great question that's come in. This particular grower does see a lot of leaf scarring and doesn't necessarily feel that it's attributed to, excess airflow, improper rough handling. Is there a possibility that it could be caused from misting or from chemical applications?
It can. Both misting and chemical applications could be an abrasion caused by too much pressure and the wrong droplet size coming out of the application equipment. So I know many growers with booms, for example, are using an angle where they apply the mist over the cuttings, not straight down on the cuttings, but rather out to let the droplets fall by gravity onto the cuttings. And spray equipment is really important. We've even seen in greenhouses where, as you get closer to the aisle where the spray equipment is and the applicator is standing, that there's actually more abrasion and damage caused by that. But there are many things that can cause damage to the leaves, especially the damage can occur when the leaf is small and then you actually see it later as the leaf unfolds and grows. So you want to be really careful. They are sensitive. You don't want to squeeze the tips physically with your hand, and then be very careful to maintain high humidity and minimize the stress to the cuttings so that you don't get any tissue damage, which later shows up as scarring.
Yeah, I visited a grower this week also that they actually turned the emitters upside down, as Roger talked about, not just with the type of irrigation system that they're using, they've just turned them upside down so that the mist is kind of going up and then falling gently down on the cuttings. It kind of breaks up that water droplet. It helps to increase the humidity as it's being done, and then it's, it's definitely a better scenario for the leaves. So, okay, we've had quite a few questions that have come in, but we do have, most of them are questions that we'll be covering as we get on further here. So I'm going to let Roger go ahead and continue, and he's going to talk with us about fertility.
Okay, fertility is really important because of all that water I just described that we apply. We tend to leach the nutrients from the cuttings very quickly and from the media if there is any. So it's important to feed at 7 to 10 days after stick. 150 parts is good. Some growers use 100, some use 125, some use 200. All that's fine. You may want to rinse it off, especially if you've got some phosphorus in there, because it can cause distortion and some harm to the tips. But after you do the application overhead. But generally, low ammonium, low phosphorus feeds are fine. If the cuttings are hard and you want to get phosphorus into them, or maybe tissue analysis has shown that they need it, you can apply it. Just be sure to rinse it off before it dries on the cuttings, especially as you move on in the mist cycle and propagation cycle, and you're applying less plain water to the mist system. 10% phosphorus is normally too high, not usually necessary at this stage. The 3 and 5% type phosphorus fertilizers are fine to get enough into the cutting. The goal is to have enough nutrition in the cutting at the time of pinch that it's at its maximum state, so that you then have proper nutrition to push the laterals out and get good quality growth and good breaking action off the cuttings. So you deplete some of the nutrients in the first week or 10 days. Start then as the callus forms, get the fertilizer back onto the plants, into the soil and get them on their way back to recovery so that 4 or 5 weeks later, if you pinch, you're in good nutritional status in the tissue. And always rinse with clear water after any applications of, with phosphorus. We don't really recommend feed in the mist. You're more likely to see algae and fungus gnats follow the algae, of course. Phosphorus can burn and distort the tips. There's a good photo there of that. You know, one feed fits all, can't vary by variety. What happens is whatever your feed is in the mist, it's going on the light green varieties, the big cuttings, the small cuttings. You know, it doesn't really give you much control. There's also an opportunity to over-apply fertilizer through that. Maybe crossover valves aren't closed. It's kind of risky, and you don't get to go back and do it again. If you go to, if you're feeding your mums at 500 parts per million, that happens to come into your poinsettia prop, you'll probably burn your cuttings very quickly within, a day of an application. So be really careful. Pure clean water is the best, and don't use phosphoric acid to neutralize your high pH water. We don't want phosphorus in there. It's very hard to judge nutrient status level just by looking at the color of the leaves. That can depend on how much light the stock was grown in and some other factors. So it's good to look at other signals or get some tissue analysis done. Color does vary by variety, and it varies by light levels. So it's normal for cutting. So look a little hungry in propagation. Don't get too anxious to have to get the feed on in the first few days. Just wait 7 to 10 days, put it on. If you're worried about height, you think you're going to stretch them if you feed them, get the feed on and then use the growth regulators to control the height. That'll keep them down. So those B9 cycocell work very well in propagation for height control, keeping the nodes stacked. And that's not a high level of fertility. 150 parts per million won't push the cuttings. Okay, for height management, PGR'S. Some varieties can be successfully propagated without PGR'S. Good idea to open up our catalog, look at the chart, and if you're not familiar with a variety, check and see what its vigor level is, because odds are the cutting, the more vigorous types are going to be a little more vigorous in propagation as well as in finishing. PGR'S will help tone the cuttings and reduce stretch, and they can help improve branching. So you kind of diminish the apical dominance. Low light levels and excess misting will encourage stretch. And when cuttings are allowed to stretch, branching may be compromised. So something to think about. This does influence the result of your pinch later on. Naturally compact varieties require less PGR, of course, even in propagation, and light leaf varieties stretch more readily in propagation. Not too many really light leaf varieties used a lot anymore, but just something to keep in mind. Good to get those applications on before the stretch occurs. The new 1.5 inch or Euro cuttings that we offer have smaller leaves and length between the internodes, so PGRs may not be needed or might be needed at a lower rate than you're used to if you've just switched to that cutting type. So that's something you need to read the plant, look at the leaf size, look at the stem, watch how quickly they root, and determine what your application rates need to be based on what you see as you go through 2 or 3 times a week and analyze the crop. If high temperatures lead to increased misting, frequency stretch may be a concern. So again, your weather conditions and coupled with your light conditions may help to influence the decision about making the applications. And you can always start with a low application, like the 1200 part per million B9 plus 750 cycocell, and you can put another application on if you feel you need it. So don't just necessarily jump in and put a lot onto the crop at a high rate and hammer the crop and then try to get them out of that excessive condition, especially if you're growing some of the more compact varieties like strawberries and green, any of the orange spice is fairly compact. You do not need any growth regulator at all on those. And the pack load products are generally too strong. They need to be applied to the stem, and that's really difficult to do, especially in liner propagation, to target just the stem. So generally for these early stages of propagation production, when there isn't much stem and there's a lot of leaf sitting out there, you'll find very effective impact by the applications of cycocell and B9. PGR frequency. First application 7 to 10 days, very important, especially on some of the medium and more vigorous varieties. To put that first application on helps to keep the early rooters, the little more aggressive cuttings, from jumping, but it does not stall or stunt the smaller cuttings that might be within the population. So recommend don't skip that application. Or put a light one on, at least to get something on if you think there's any chance that you'll see jumping occur. PGRs, 2 sprays, don't skip the first. So if you think you don't need a lot of PGR, you're better off to not apply the second, but the first one does help give you the leveling effect. So here in these cuttings you can see we skipped the first PGR application. Some of the cuttings are that rooted before the others probably are twice the length in internode as ones that were slower to root. And here you can see skipping the first vividly, you're at least 60-70% higher on the cutting that was skipped. The lower photo shows it with the leaves still intact on the cutting, where you skip the first spray, you start to get the lack of uniformity. Here's a nice and uniform crop, good first application, good second application, and they look really very tabletop, smooth and even. It's a great crop right there. Any questions?
We don't have any that have come in specifically about growth regulating, but we do have a question that goes back to relating to mist. If we're not recommending phosphoric acid to acidify the water in propagation, then what's an alternative source for acidification?
Citric acid is fairly easy to work with, and sulfuric acid can be used too, but that needs careful handling. So, follow label instructions. But generally, water quality, poinsettias tolerate a wide range of water pHs, and we don't usually see problems, even if the pH is 7.5 in the water. So it would have to be more extreme, and most of the labs that do water testing could actually walk you through whether you really need to worry about it during that propagation phase and help you make a decision about the right acid to use. But our recommendation is it's the phosphorus and phosphoric acid that makes it questionable.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to environmental management at this point. And this section is, just a reminder of managing the environment properly so that you can eliminate the need for excess mist and have some nicely rooted cuttings. And it's also a reminder of how important the tools are to have in place. The digital soil thermometer is really important. As I mentioned earlier, the mist is going to cool your media, and you're going to have slow rooting if your media is too cool. So it's a good idea to have a soil probe on hand. They're fairly economical, and they can also be used to insert into unopened boxes to see where that temperature is in those boxes that you just received. Might give you a good heads up if those cuttings were allowed to heat up in transit. Infrared thermometers are also very common. There is some, question out there about how reliable the infrared thermometers are, but, they are commonly used. Ideal light levels in propagation should be 1,200 to 1,500 foot candles. If it's less than 1,000 to 1,200, then stretch and slow rooting is likely. If it's more than 1,500 to 1,600 foot candles, you're going to need excess mist to keep those cuttings happy, and it can result in some foliage burn, bleaching, or scarring. So, ideally we like to see that right around the 1,200 to 1,500 foot candle range. Just remember that too much mist to compensate for high light increases disease and leaches out the nutrients. So, we don't want to try to cut corners on the light levels there, and really be monitoring where your light levels are and adjusting, level of shade, etc. accordingly if light levels are changing. This is a good picture of a light meter. Just remember it's just as important as an EC meter in poinsettia propagation, and especially in those first few days you should be out there checking those light levels several times a day. Light management, just remember to shade those southeast and west walls. That's where their highest intensity of light is going to be coming from. In terms of temperature management, we've talked a lot about the importance of keeping it cooler the first 3 days to keep those cuttings as stress-free as possible, and then running an aggressive environment after that. For best callus formation, we like to see the media temperature at 70 to 75 degrees, and then day temperatures can range from 76 to 82, but that's after those first 3 days. And ideally in the real world, that's, those are nice temperatures. I know in a lot of greenhouses in the summer it can be much warmer than that, and if we could get it down to 82 degrees, that would be wonderful. As I mentioned, night temperatures can range from 70 to 74, but you can, those first 3 days, you can let them go down to 62, 64 degrees, and those cuttings will do just fine. At that point, as Roger said earlier, we're trying to keep those cuttings happy and restore their turgidity. We're not really worried so much about rooting at that point. We're just trying to get them to recover from the stresses of shipping. Temperatures below 80 degrees in the first 5 days will reduce the incidence of Erwinia, and in the next section we're going to talk about that. Temperatures outside the optimal ranges that we just discussed will slow rooting and reduce uniformity. And then in week 3, once the cuttings are rooted, bottom heat can be removed. Hopefully at that point we've backed off on the mist and temperatures can be reduced about 5 degrees. Light levels can also be increased. That's what we would, consider like a toning type environment. This is a great picture here of a grower that we know that for humidity management, they're rooting on like wire mesh benches, and they've put that plastic down to reduce airflow and just get the humidity up. So, you want to reduce excess airflow as much as possible, wet down walkways, even in adjacent areas to propagation, just to keep that overall humidity up. This is a great picture of leaf scarring when there's not enough, when the humidity is low, light levels possibly high. Could also be from the mist, but these particular cuttings here look like it's just from a dry propagation environment. Insect and disease management is a really important aspect of propagation. The environment plays a critical role in disease management. We've stressed sanitation several times already today, so we won't talk much more about that, but definitely prior to sticking, that's going to decrease the incidence of waterborne pathogens if you're using good sanitation. Controlling the heat in the first 3 days will go a long way to reduce the incidence of Erwinia. Also, hopefully we're doing our part to ensure that we have shipped quality cuttings as stress-free as possible, and that's going to go a long way with the Erwinia as well. Proper environment so that misting isn't excessive is also going to reduce the incidences of botrytis. Environment also plays a role in insect pressure. Media that's excessively wet will promote the presence of fungus gnats. If it's, if you've got excessive wet media with that organic matter, that's where your fungus gnats are going to thrive. And then, those drains like Roger talked about and the algae under the benches create a fungus gnat hotel. So pay attention to your environment when it comes to insects as well. Fungus gnat, sanitation. The lime slurry is also going to help. Moisture management again. And then a lot of growers, especially if they're direct sticking, do have a preventative rotation in place for fungus gnats. Some chemicals, effective chemicals of choice to consider would be things like Duragard, Safari, or Citation. And consult the labels on all of those chemicals for recommended rates and methods of application. Foliar diseases, we did have a question that came in earlier about leaf yellowing, and botrytis is kind of a secondary effect of leaf yellowing. The biggest concern with leaf yellowing is that you can have botrytis that sets in on those falling leaves, and it can slow rooting, but the larger concern is definitely botrytis. A preventative weekly fungicide applications may be necessary if your environment warrants it. Some growers that really have a good handle on misting and good handle in place for processing those cuttings might not have a situation where they need it, but some chemicals to consider would be things like Decree, Chipco, or Daconil. And be careful again, though some of those, especially Daconil, could be kind of a hot chemical. So best to manage your environment and misting first and then rely on chemicals second. Good picture of botrytis here where it's set in on the tip. That particular cutting there needs to be removed from the environment, or we're going to be spreading the spores to adjacent cuttings and throughout the propagation house. Yucky picture of Erwinia here. This is really what it looks like when it's nice and slimy, and it's probably stinky too. Erwinia is definitely not a good situation. The thing about Erwinia, though, is it's really kind of something where it's going to be a problem within the first 3 days of sticking. If it's generally not seen after that. It's more kind of something that sets in on cuttings that are stressed from the propagation environment, and if you can get through those first 3 days, you're going to be in the clear in terms of Erwinia. So, once you get some hot spots in the greenhouse, it may not even be necessary other than to clean those areas up to apply a fungicide, because it's not, once temperatures are a little bit more managed, you've got your misting levels down and the cuttings are turgid, Erwinia shouldn't set in. So we'll talk more about prevention here than management. These are some good preventative measures to have in place for Erwinia. Don't pre-wet the cuttings more than 24, or pre-wet the media more than 24 hours in advance, especially for direct sticking. We don't want to see you pre-wet that media like a week in advance just because labor is available and then stick, because you can definitely create a situation where you're just brewing pathogens. Use a clean water supply. We already talked about that. And make sure the greenhouse is clean and sanitized prior to sticking. Train your labor to sanitize hands often, change gloves, etc. Erwinia is a waterborne pathogen. It can be kind of ever-present and can be easily transmitted on hands and gloves. When you are leaf picking, sometimes if you're removing a yellow leaf or something at stick, train your labor to remove only half the petiole so that you're not creating a fresh wound on that stem. Erwinia does need a wound to enter the cutting. Be careful not to hold the cuttings too hard. We've already said that a few times today, that they are fragile, and you can actually see where growers have, or labor or whoever's sticking the cuttings have pinched the base of that cutting too hard, and it creates a situation where Erwinia can enter the plant. If stems need to be recut for whatever reason, never recut the stems and stick immediately. It's always a good idea, if you have to recut, to cut and then store in a cooler until the cut end is dry and sealed, so there's not a place for that Erwinia to get in. And we've already said keep the greenhouse temperatures cool for the first 3 days, and that'll help reduce the incidence of Erwinia. Xanthomonas is something that we want to briefly touch on. It has been more of a concern in Europe and in North America in the last couple years. It is typically an issue in propagation, and it can be exaggerated by heat and excess water. We've already said we want that environment uncomfortable. We want it hot. We want it humid. Perfect environment for bacterial leaf spotting. And it is spread by splashing water, and mist equals splashing water. Sanitation prior to the season is very important to prevent carryover if the disease was present in previous seasons. So, things like chlorine, bleach need to be used, or quaternary ammonia, and all the things that we talked about earlier in terms of cleaning up the greenhouse prior to the season. This is a good picture here of Xanthomonas and the spotting that it can leave. If Xanthomonas is an issue in propagation, there is a chemical rotation that can be used, including Phyton, and you can see the rates there, 20 ounces per 100 gallons. It's something that needs to be applied on a weekly basis for 2 to 3 weeks. You have to be careful with Phyton, though, because you can't use any B9. So, if it is a situation where you have to use Phyton, whether it's for Erwinia or for bacterial leaf spotting, you need to discontinue B9 use. You can't use surfactants either with the Phyton. And for optimum results, there have been some added benefits seen with using Bacillus subtilis in the form of either cease or Rhapsody. And you can include camelot in the rotation, but that's a copper salt, so you want to be careful with the camelot. It can be a little bit hotter than Phyton. And the thing to remember about Xanthomonas is that any type of leaf wetness is going to exaggerate the spread the bacteria, including insecticide sprays, including PGR sprays, anything but that copper fungicide, basically. So keep that in mind. Roger, any additional comments while I look through the questions?
As I was listening to what you were saying, I remember the discussion about the mist. It's really important when you're running a boom that you not blast down towards the cuttings, and it's not only for the potential abrasion, but just letting the water float and then drop down onto the plants is a better strategy for not spreading spores or not spreading a Xanthomonas or other bacterial infection around, because that air pressure that goes with the water pressure tends to make things fly around a bit, and it's a better sanitation situation if you don't use that. Just a couple things too. Chapter 3 in the Poinsettia manual is on propagation. There's a lot of really good information that discusses some of these points even in more detail, and so just another resource to take a look at besides the webinars for sort of getting refresher as we head into the season.
Okay, thanks, Roger. We're going to go ahead and move on to common problems that you see in propagation, and this is sort of a wrap-up of today's presentation with a great series of pictures, and Roger's going to take us through that.
Okay, here we talked about environmental changes. Now a grower might look at that and say, I got to get some fertilizer on that, it's hungry. Well, it's actually a sun scald situation. I'd put more shade on it, and if you feed, just feed them 100 parts, 150 parts. Don't go crazy trying to make it green up. That's not good. that's probably not what's the problem here. There might even be damage to the cuticle, and it makes it more sensitive not only to the sun scalding further, but also to any chemical applications or growth regulators that you may put on the plant. So change the environment very slowly with poinsettias. You can't really be too humid. Don't worry about botrytis on a poinsettia in August coming out of prop, and because it's too warm. At that point, keep the humidity high and minimize the free water towards the end of propagation, but keep humidities high. You'd be surprised when it's 90 degrees how hard it is to actually keep the humidity high for a plant. Here's a shot of heat damage in transit, so right after sticking you may see. Typical is that central yellowing that's in the palm of the leaf there, and that's a typical sign of heat stress during shipping process. And then this is what it can be like a few days later, and you can see the overall impact. Those leaves may have to be removed. You can wait and see if they actually upsize and need to be cleaned out. But a few leaves have already dropped off those plants and are sitting between the trays, so not a nice situation. And neither is that. That's sort of extreme. Not much you can do there. By the time it recovers, you've probably lost. Before it reaches that stage, I'd get some replacements in and replant, because not much you're going to be able to do with that. Not for this year anyway. Cold damage looks different. It gets black. Cold damage tends to affect the younger growth, it seems, in the tips and the newly unfolded leaves, whereas the heat damage seems to go right to that big old leaf at the base of the cutting. So a couple of things to watch for. If you think you have a problem, be sure to get photographs and send those in. We certainly want to know if you receive any shipments that are overheated or might have any problems, and help identify what the problem is. Photographs are really good to record. And there's a shot of some chemical damage. Spray just laid right up in there and caused burn and curl. So maybe the cutting was just allowed to dry too much before fungicide was applied. I don't know exactly what happened in this case, but again, be really careful about applying chemicals in the first 2 or 3 days if you can avoid it, because of the potential to do this kind of damage if the humidities drop and it gets hot. Fertilizer in the mist, there's another shot causing distortion. Now this plant's growing out of it, so you wouldn't give up. And those leaves will be hidden later in the finished crop, but the tip's okay. You can actually lose the tip from fertilizer in the mist, so that's one of the reasons we really don't recommend it. Feed them through the roots. It's safer. Physical damage. Now this likely was physical damage that occurred at the time of sticking. This cutting's obviously it's starting to grow on. It's got good roots and so forth, but the damage shows up after the cutting unfolds, so be very careful how you handle the cutting when you plant. Make sure they don't hold the tip when they stick the cutting. They should be holding part of the stem as they plant. Okay, in summary, top 5 reasons that propagation can go poorly. Certainly Rebecca and I get calls all the time, and technical support of customers. We've seen a lot. Oftentimes they've got too much light. They might be 3,500, even 4,000 foot candles, and it just is not good. That makes them have to put water on, so they end up too wet, and then the humidity's too low because they're ventilating, because they need to try to cool things down because it's so bright and hot. And then another one would be rapid environmental changes, and then poor sanitation. So most of these are very fixable. We do recommend good shade and less air movement in propagation and high humidity. And for slow, uneven rooting, too cold. You might see that in August in the north. So maybe if you're in Florida, it's not an issue, but it will slow them down and cause unevenness. Wet kind of can go with cold, but it can also on its own, if there's lack of oxygen in the media, you can end up with poor root out, and that will slow them down. And too dark can be a problem. So you get down under 1,000 or 1,200 foot candles, and you'll start to see a slowdown in the rooting. And cuttings will look nice and dark, but they won't do much. So you really want 1,500 foot candles, maybe 1,800 foot candles for propagation. Too much growth regulator that can stop any plant if it's too high, and just too bright will cause uneven rooting as well. Some of the cuttings being impacted more than others that get uneven. Uneven growth, not grading a plant. I mean, if you see small cuttings, set them aside, put them all together, and don't apply PGR'S to those. uneven temperatures from one end of the range to the other, uneven light levels, anything that causes uneven stresses to the population that you planted can give you uneven growth, and that can be caused by uneven rooting, or as Rebecca pointed out, not uncovering the tips can cause uneven growth as well. Generally, the tip underneath a leaf will not develop. The plant stops growing. I guess it's for whatever reason, hormonal thing, or just the lower light levels, they do not grow as well, as quickly. Any questions?
Okay, yep, this is our last opportunity for questions because we're just about finished here. One question that's come in, this particular grower has seen something similar to a couple slides we showed where there's the hardened tip, kind of like a fishboning sort of appearance on the leaf, some reddish discoloration, but not always. They don't use phosphorus and overhead fertilizer. They don't use phosphoric acid in their mist, and so they're wondering if there's other things that can cause that type of distortion in the tip aside from phosphorus.
Oh, well, that's a good question. Don't have a picture of it. I'm having a tough time visualizing what that might be. What do you think?
I do get calls, on that very topic. A lot of times, sometimes we see it after pinch, especially where you'll see that type of distorted growth, and, we can kind of rule out the phosphorus right away. It can be, kind of a physiological type situation where it's either been triggered by heat or possibly mechanical damage early on. A lot of times when you see like that fishboning type thing or uneven margins or distortion, that's damage that occurred as that, that leaf was forming in the cells, and then as it expands, it looks kind of distorted. So I would look at things like chemical, heat stress, possibly environment, or mechanical damage if you've been able to rule out phosphorus. But, that's a good point that Roger makes. Always pictures are very helpful for us, when we're working through a technical support issue, because a lot of things can mimic other things. The leaf scarring thing is a good example. Is it mechanical damage, or is it excess air movement, or did it happen from a certain chemical application? So pictures are always really important and a good useful tool for us. I think that we really have covered all the questions that have come in today. And again, as I mentioned before, Roger and I can always both be contacted via email or phone if there's any questions that you should have after today. I'd like to let you all know that again this year for 2011 we are doing the Ecke Ranch Roadshows again. Some of you may have attended our roadshows last year. We have one coming up this Wednesday at QPAC in New Jersey, which Roger will be the host of, and that takes place June 29th. So if you'd like some information about attending that roadshow and you're in that area, just let us know. We're also having one at Duane's in Michigan on Tuesday, August 2nd, and our key account sales rep, Sam Kimling, will be the host for that particular event. And then again, we'll be at Plant Peddler in Cresco, Iowa on August 4th, and I'll be the host of that event. So if you're interested in attending, please be sure to let us know. We'd love to have you. This is the first session for our 2011 Poinsettia webinar series. In July, we're going to be talking about height tracking and height management. So we're going to go through all the aspects of growth regulating, height management through cultural practices, and then how to use graphical tracking, how it works and why it works. In August, we're going to talk about transition management. And that's kind of that transition phase of establishing and getting those cuttings acclimated to a different greenhouse environment after propagation. September will be pest and fertility management, so we're going to get in depth on all the different pests, including diseases and insects in the greenhouse, and then fertility management and all the aspects of that. And then October we'll do late height control, finishing, and post-harvest management. So we'll be at a point where we can talk about getting those wonderful poinsettias out of your greenhouse. As always, just a reminder of the resources we have available. The onboard Tech Help Bulletin Board is always available for all your questions. We've got some activity going on there, some things happen in there, so be sure to check it out. And Ecke Tech Support, that's my phone number and my email, so don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions or need support. That's what we're here for. On behalf of the entire staff at the Ecke Ranch, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the first session in the 2011 series. We hope things are going well for you this season. We wish you luck on your poinsettia season, and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.